But what a scene did we witness. The majesty of the people had disappeared, and the whole house had been inundated by the rabble mob. We came too late. The president, after having been literally nearly pressed to death and almost suffocated and torn to pieces by the people in their eagerness to shake hands with Old Hickory, had retreated through the back way or south front and had escaped to his lodgings at Gadsby's. Ladies fainted, men were seen with bloody noses, and such a scene of confusion took place as is impossible to describe. Those who got in could not get out by the door again, but had to scramble out of windows. At one time, the president, who had retreated and retreated until he was pressed against the wall, could only be secured by a number of gentlemen forming around him and making a kind of barrier of their own bodies. And the pressure was so great that Colonel Bomford, who was one, said that at one time he was afraid they should have been pushed down or on the president. It was then the windows were thrown open and the torrent found an outlet which otherwise might have proved fatal. This concourse had not been anticipated and therefore not provided against. Ladies and gentlemen only had been expected at this levee, not the people en masse. But it was the people's day, and the people's president and the people would rule. This was how Margaret Smith, one of the pillars of high Washington, D.C. society, described the scene of Andrew Jackson's first inauguration on March 11, 1829. After a bitter rematch with the sitting President John Quincy Adams in the 1828 election, the 61-year-old man of the people had vanquished his elitist political rival and entered the White House as the 7th President of the United States. Jackson's rise to power can teach us a lot about how American conceptions of democracy changed during the early 19th century, and his singular impact was so great that it has led historians to refer to this period as the Jacksonian Era, and the changes in American democracy he influenced to be called Jacksonian Democracy. The earliest years of Jackson are ones steeped in at least as much mythology as fact. But for the sake of some background on the seminal figure, let's briefly take a look at how his past was presented. We know that he was born in the Waxhaws region of the Carolinas, but we can't pin down an exact birthplace. His mother, Elizabeth, was sadly already a widow, as Jackson's father, also named Andrew, had died roughly 3 weeks before the birth of his son. Only 8 years old when the hostilities of the American Revolution broke out, he served in the South Carolina militia at the age of 13 and spent time as a British prisoner of war. The war also took the lives of an older brother and his mother, leaving the young Jackson an orphan at 14, and instilled a hatred of the British that followed him the rest of his life. He was determined to move up in life. He read the law and was admitted to the North Carolina bar in 1787, the same year the Constitutional Convention was taking place in Philadelphia. I'll let the esteemed James McGregor Hughes sum up Jackson's meteoric social climbing in his early years. Then he moved west, finally settling in Nashville, where he continued to prosper. Attorney General for the Morrow District at 24, delegate to the Tennessee Constitutional Convention 4 years later, elected the first member of Congress from Tennessee at 29, United States Senator at 30, a judge in the Supreme Court of Tennessee a year later. Jackson established himself as a national hero during the War of 1812. Originally a general in the Tennessee State Militia, he eventually became a major general in the regular United States Army. In January of 1815, he became an almost mythical figure in his own lifetime by defeating a British army in the Battle of New Orleans. Poems, plays, songs were soon being written about the victory of American militiamen against the same British soldiers who had just defeated Napoleon, and Jackson stood out in all of this media as the prime hero of a new nationalism building in the U.S. after New Orleans. In 1818, Jackson received rather vague orders to do something about bands of Seminole who were raiding across the border of Spanish Florida. It seems likely that he purposely misunderstood what was being asked of him and led to what was essentially an illegal invasion of the region. Spain was understandably deeply upset, but things worked out yet again for Jackson, as the official U.S. government stance was to back his actions and led to the Adams-Onis Treaty in 1819 that officially brought Florida into the United States. By the 1820s, he emerged as a true political figure, but one who looked at the Washington establishment with a very deep skepticism. To Jackson, the democracy of the times was inadequate. It was a curated system run by a very small circle of coastal elites that largely ignored the will of the, quote, common man in the expanding West. The turning point would come in 1824. Jackson finally ran for president, but despite winning the popular vote and having the most electoral votes, he was denied the presidency because he did not win the Electoral College. In that scenario, the House of Representatives had to select the president from the top candidates, and in what Jackson famously dubbed the corrupt bargain, they chose John Quincy Adams instead. This defeat fundamentally changed public perception. It wasn't just that Jackson lost. His supporters saw it as a theft of the people's voice. It framed the next 4 years as a crusade to take the government back from these aristocrats, symbolized by Adams, who was the son of the second president, and a Harvard-educated lawyer himself, a career diplomat from Massachusetts. The crusade was powered by a massive change in the American electorate, which was the extension of suffrage, or the right to vote. States were starting to drop property requirements, allowing non-elites like Jackson, someone who didn't have a famous last name, a man who had lived through extreme childhood poverty and become one of the most successful men of the new American West, to mobilize an entirely new class of voters. When he ran against Adams in 1828, the outcome was very different. Voter turnout skyrocketed from just 26.9% in 1824 to 57.6%, and in real numbers, it jumped from 360,000 votes to over 1.1 million. This time, the results were resounding in Jackson's favor. Over 55% of the popular vote and a more than 2-to-1 margin in the electoral vote. The 1828 election proved that you no longer needed a pedigree from Virginia or Massachusetts to win. You only needed the majesty of the people behind you. However, once in the White House, Jackson wielded that power in a way that many found authoritarian. He didn't just represent the people, he sometimes claimed to be the sole representative of the people's will. It was noticeable enough that even Thomas Jefferson, the first leader of the Democratic Party that Jackson had run for as a candidate, supposedly remarked once to Daniel Webster, "I feel much alarmed at the prospect of seeing General Jackson president. He is one of the most unfit men I know of for such a place. He has had very little respect for laws and constitutions, and is in fact an able military chief. His passions are terrible. When I was president of the Senate, he was senator, and he could never speak on account of the rashness of his feelings. I have seen him attempt it repeatedly, and as often choke with rage. His passions are no doubt cooler now. He has been much tried since I knew him, but he is a dangerous man." His passions and strong conviction for his own policy agenda led him to bypass Congress and the Supreme Court on occasion. The state of Georgia had been aggressively dismantling Cherokee sovereignty until a case, Worcester v. Georgia, finally landed before the Supreme Court. Chief Justice John Marshall, a man that defined American law for 3 decades, ruled that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct community where the laws of Georgia had no force. Jackson didn't respond with any formal legal rebuttal. He simply ignored the court's ruling. The famous quote, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it," is most likely apocryphal, but he did reveal himself to his friend, Brigadier General John Coffee, when he said that the decision of the Supreme Court has fell stillborn, implying that the court had no true power to stop him. If Jackson viewed the court as an annoyance, he viewed the Second Bank of the United States as his mortal enemy. In his mind, the bank was a many-headed monster, a private corporation fueled by British investors and coastal elites that were holding the federal government hostage. The bank's president, Nicholas Biddle, was everything Jackson loathed. Aristocratic, highly educated, and convinced that the bank was more stable than the office of the president. Biddle greatly underestimated Jackson's hatred for the existing financial system when he pushed for an early recharter of the bank in 1832 to force his hand during an election year. Unsurprisingly, the charter legislation was vetoed by Jackson, who argued that the bank was unauthorized by the Constitution and dangerous to the liberties of the people. In fact, he utilized the veto more than all his predecessors combined, essentially saying that if the law didn't align with his vision of the common good, it didn't belong in his America. The key takeaway here is that Jackson's rise changed the DNA of American politics. He created the template for the modern political party and the Imperial Presidency. He set the example for a strong executive who, through sheer force of will and very powerful charisma, could chart his own path for the country. Jackson believed that as the only government official elected by all the people of the United States, he had a direct mandate to make sweeping institutional changes and strongly enforce executive power. There was a precedent set during his 2 terms from 1829 to 1837 that strengthened the conception of appropriate executive powers, and the use of a veto as a policy weapon fundamentally shifted the balance of government, creating a model that presidents have continued to utilize as they chart their paths for the country. While the right to vote was greatly expanded in this era, Jackson's rise to political power showed the young country that even a man of the people could lean into executive overreach. Jacksonian democracy left us with a legacy that we still grapple with today: the tension between the power of the popular vote and the protections of our institutional guardrails built into the Constitution.